Hello and welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. Last month we saw an historic election that led to the change in control of the U.S. House of Representatives. When Congress convenes again in January, what other changes, historic or otherwise, might we see? If it was up to an emerging group of young grassroots activists, we'll see a Green New Deal. And that just might be truly historic and planet-saving. On this edition of Other Voices, we're going to talk about what a Green New Deal might be and how it might come about in this new Congress. And joining me to help us explore this is Christopher D. Cook, author and award-winning journalist. Christopher, welcome.
Hey, nice to meet with you. Yeah.
Let me just give you a little more introduction. Christopher Cook is an author and award-winning investigative journalist. His writing appears in Harper's, The Atlantic, the Los Angeles Times, Mother Jones, The Economist, The Nation, you get the idea, a long list, and many other national publications. He's the author of the acclaimed book, Diet for a Dead Planet, Big Business and the Coming Food Crisis. Christopher's articles have garnered national honors, including the Aronson Award, Project Censored Award, finalist for an Investigative Reporters and Editors Award, and a two-time finalist for a Livingston Award, which is for young journalists. I think you no longer qualify. So.
Thank you. I passed that point. Life goes on, right?
Under 30, I think it is, right?
33.
33.
Yeah, just last year,
So
I just
I don't
passed
think
the marking point. No.
Anyway, welcome. So I had wanted to do a program on the Green New Deal, and when I started Googling to see what resources might be available, your most recent article at The Nation was the first thing that came up, and it was about the Green New Deal and about the Sunrise Movement, which we're going to talk about in a minute. They really helped get things off to quite a start. We've got a little clip of what happened at Nancy Pelosi's office, but give us a little taste of a run-in, lead into this.
No, it's pretty amazing. I think they caught everybody by surprise, all of us. I mean, it was just kind of out of nowhere. I was pitching my editors at The Nation this idea a few days before the protest, saying, like, this would be a great thing for us to talk about for the incoming Congress.
The Green New Deal.
Yeah, the Green New Deal. Which isn't something we just invented, of course, but it hadn't been talked about for a while. And they gave me the green light, so to speak. I started working on it, and then suddenly there were protests in Nancy Pelosi's office, and organized by the Sunrise Movement, which is a really interesting, very new, young movement, both in terms of the organization's history being about a year old, and members often being anywhere from 15 to 25 years old. So it's a really like young people's movement.
Let's take a look at the clip, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the Sunrise, if we can have this clip rolled in. And those of you here in the studio audience, look to your right.
Know how proud I am of each and every single one of you for putting yourselves and your bodies and everything on the line to make sure that we save our planet, our generation, and our future. It's so incredibly important. I've shared with you all, and I've shared my story that my journey here started at Standing Rock. And it started with everyday people doing exactly what you all were doing
And that's the Sunrise Movement in Nancy Pelosi's office 1 week after the election. I read just another report of it today. It might have been another one of yours that Nancy's spokesperson said it was the first time she's ever had to deal with a sit-in led by another member of Congress.
Yeah, so, that was a first for me.
I think there's a learning curve for a lot of people in Congress coming up.
Yeah.
But let's talk briefly about Sunrise Movement, because this action at Pelosi's office really kind of leaped this idea onto the agenda.
It really did. I mean, in an instant, and they've been really forceful and aggressive and following through all around the country. So they had, a few days after that, they had rallies in hundreds of congressional districts around the country. Folks would show up at the district offices and protest or encourage the member to sign on to the Green New Deal Select Committee proposal by Ocasio-Cortez. And so they've been really, upping the ante and pushing the pressure points. And, they're very active, of course, on social media. And they've made it a real story. And I think that what's interesting is, I don't think anybody has any illusions that suddenly this is just going to sail through the House and then the Senate. And, of course, President so-and-so is going to sign it, right?
We're still talking a long-term project.
Yeah,
here,
but very smartly, wisely, they're talking about laying the groundwork for 2020 and having this whole thing ready to go when there's a new president and perhaps a new Senate. So they're really going after different members of Congress, and they've started to get more and more backing. They now have 19 members of Congress supporting the Select Committee proposal. And so that number seems to grow just about every day by a couple. And some of them are longtime veterans like John Lewis, some real old standbys, and then a lot of new folks, Rashida Tlaib, and some other newly elected representatives as well. So
locally here on the peninsula, Jackie Spear and Ro Khanna have both endorsed the idea, and over the weekend we put out a letter for people to sign to Anna Eshoo to encourage her to get on it, who is the representative here for Palo Alto. And I can't imagine why Anna might have objections to this, so maybe she'll be number 20 as a result of our weekend action. One thing, and then I want to get into the specifics of the Green New Deal, but one of the things I was impressed with is a couple of things about the Sunrise Movement. First of all, they are endorsing candidates at state and federal level and putting people out on the streets to support those candidates. But a big part of their thing is talking to your peers and encouraging people to just talk to your neighbors and classmates and things like that.
Yeah.
They really seem to have thought out a really good plan of outreach and organizing and direct action.
Yeah, no, they have. It's interesting, and I've seen more detailed plans they have for how they're talking about sort of building up this support, and they have this nice mixture of the online, the social media. At first, sometimes when you see that, you want to make sure, is this a real thing or do they just have some good PR? And then you find out they put people out in the streets, folks who know the issues, who are like very, very committed. And the young folks, again, it's not all young folks, but it's primarily young folks leading the charge. And I think it's a real wake-up call to all of us, the level of urgency. We had the big intergovernmental panel on climate change come out with a big report recently showing us that we have 10 to 12 years before irreversible catastrophe sets in. We've been hearing this for a long time now, 30 years, 20 years. Now we're down to 10 to 12 years.
Yeah.
And some of the effects might already be irreversible, but we're getting to that point where if you think about a 10 to 12 year period and all the things that would have to happen to get to that kind of 100% renewable by 2030, and you think about how long it takes first to get legislation passed, and then actually enacted and then implemented, then you can see why there's a level of urgency going on.
Absolutely. I've had a couple of the scientists from the intergovernmental panel on this program a couple of times, and their message was that although the Paris Agreement was good, it was a big international breakthrough, it's just insufficient to actually address the cause. And like you say, we have this NOAA report that really gives us a very tight timeline. And of course, young people are going to feel this because they're the ones that are
Yeah.
looking at a very long future. Like this.
Absolutely, and people talking about whether or not they even want to have kids.
Yeah.
That level.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true. Well, let's talk about the Green New Deal, and first on a kind of a broad stroke, wide angle camera. You alluded to the fact that this is not a new idea, or at least a term. I mean, Green New Deal has been used. I think Jill Stein used that in her last couple of presidential campaigns. What's the history of it, and how did we get from that history to where we are?
Yeah, and it's about a 10-year-old concept, I guess you could say, in terms of it being sort of coined as a phrase back in around 2007. And I think before that, people were talking already about green jobs for quite a while, and greener investments and this kind of thing. But now there's this idea of a Green New Deal, which really brings together the concepts of renewable energy expansion, massive carbon reduction, decarbonization, and the New Deal concepts, which are about this blend of urgency, of creating jobs, of creating stimulus. I talk in my stories about, why would we, some people have been pushing back from the Republican side, shockingly, saying,
What a surprise.
they're bound to find something, right? Instead of saying, like, why do we need a stimulus now? We have 4% unemployment, and in fact, there's vast underemployment and stagnant wages for everybody from the poor to the middle class across this country. So we're talking about, the concept, really talks about this merging between, saying that we're going to stop having this false divide also between the environment and labor, environment and work, and saying, that work has to become environmentally sustainable, ecologically sustainable. So in terms of the climate crisis, there's a whole panoply of different things that need to happen across the entire economy and across our entire infrastructure. We can go into more detail, but everything from mass transit expansion to agricultural, huge agricultural reforms in the use of soil, in how we treat our soil and waterways and air, the growing of our food, all of that. The shipping of food, for instance, there's all those areas. And then there's green building, and all the emissions that come out of buildings. So there's a whole, and there's tons more if you talk about the underlying infrastructure of waterways and sewers and piping and all the lead pipes that need to be replaced and all those sorts of things. So there's tons of work that needs to be done. This is a chance to combine these efforts of creating jobs and really replenishing the environment. So this concept, for a number of years now, people have been producing reports and studies looking at all the ways that, all the jobs that need to be created, that could be created doing this. And of course, in recent years, we've had more and more feasibility in terms of expanding the grid, the renewable energy grid. Solar has vastly expanded, getting more charging stations around the country, that kind of thing. So there's more and more of an opportunity now to move to solar and wind on a much larger scale than has been done before, and to move to electric-powered transportation, for instance.
Not only the opportunity, but the urgent need to do it.
Urgent need,
Yeah.
exactly.
So the proposal that is going to be pushed forward in the incoming Congress that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is pushing. She ran on this. She's got this 20-page outline on her campaign website, which I've been reading. I'm sure you've read it a number of times. I think you briefly mentioned select committee on the Green New Deal. So let's talk about that. That's step one.
Right.
They have to set up this select committee in the House of Representatives.
Yeah.
what are the mechanics of doing that?
This is the fun part, right?
Yes, yes. When we get into all
and
the
governance
when we get deep in the
Yeah.
weeds of Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
But
I tried to push that part down in
people
my story.
understand what the process
Yeah, no,
is.
absolutely. You know, I mean, this is all, you know, there again, going back to Sunrise and Ocasio-Cortez and others who are pushing this now, Justice Democrats being another group that's pushing this idea, they understand the politics. So by December 13th, at December 13th, Congress goes into recess. So now they're having this big push to try to get as many people to sign on before they leave the House. And this is before they've even taken seats in the new year for the newly elected Congress in January. So they're trying to set it up so they're hitting the ground running in January. What's interesting with the politics is, of course, there's horse trading, there's egos, there's turf. Representative Pelosi has talked about bringing back a committee that she helped start in 2007, which was around infrastructure and global warming. And
energy independence.
And energy independence, exactly. You know, and at the time, I think that was a pretty forward-looking concept. The problem is that at this stage, it has no legislative authority, no legislative powers.
Pelosi's
committee, right?
Yeah.
And so some of the politicking now is over. Specifically, they want to get people to promote, to support the select committee. The idea being it has the legislative authority, the investigative powers, the budget, the staffing, all these things that you need, the ability to hold hearings and produce reports, all those things. And this select committee will provide the focal point for developing a 10-year Green New Deal. So the idea that's laid out on Ocasio-Cortez's website, for instance, shows that they want to, by 2020, have legislation in place and ready to go, and passable legislation that would create this full Green New Deal over a 10-year period in terms of the job creation aspect, in terms of the infrastructure overhaul, the decarbonization, the carbon storage, all those different things that we're talking about. The politics are endlessly tricky, of course, because there's jockeying in Congress from the right and from the left, even in just the Democratic Party alone. And Pelosi, of course, is in the middle of all that as the speaker.
Right.
And so she's nagging and negotiating all this. Presumed speaker. Let's, I think we know it'll happen.
We know it'll happen.
Yeah. But just, so, it'll be interesting to see in January. I mean, not just interesting, really important to see what happens in January when they all come back. How many sign-ons there are to the select committee, and Pelosi and her office have so far been interestingly sort of waffling and non-committal about this idea. They sort of embraced the concept pretty strongly, but in interviews I've done with her staff and in other comments I've seen, they really hedge on whether they're supporting the select committee. And they'll say, yeah, we love the idea, we're going to restart that committee and all this stuff. It's like, wait a minute, which committee are we talking about?
Yeah, because that one had no power.
Because it had no power, and again, this is a different time.
They could examine and report.
Yep. Exactly.
And it was doing some important reporting and stuff, but it couldn't do any legislation.
Exactly. So this is a different time, a different Congress and a different time, and she's not opposing it. So it's, hopefully it's an opportunity where people are pushing on Barbara Lee as well, who's high up in the Democratic Party now, to also endorse this. And then you've got the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which is the biggest caucus in Congress on the Democratic side. A lot of old guard progressives and some new folks like Ro Khanna. And it'll be interesting to see if they also will back this. There's been some back and forth because they have their own ideas and their own committees. And so we get into all this hashing out, and one hopes that one way or another, the ideas and the legislation are what counts. I think the strategy right now seems to be, as I'm seeing it, that creating a select committee creates the focus. So it doesn't get hashed out by one piece by this committee, one piece over here, but like the whole concept of a Green New Deal in one committee before you can have those hearings and do those studies and reports and
write the legislation.
write the legislation.
Which will still have to go through the appropriate committees.
Yep.
But
Absolutely.
it will start in this new select committee. You mentioned briefly turf, and you also mentioned the Progressive Caucus. Raul Grijalva, who I think is still co-chair of the Progressive Caucus, congressman from Arizona, and he's going to be chairing the incoming chair of the Natural Resources Committee. He's actually, he doesn't like the legislative component of this because that's his territory in his committee. And
yeah, I mean, I'll just speak quickly there.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly, why he's hedging on it.
Yeah.
I haven't spoken with him or his office directly, but it sounds like there might be an issue of turf from the comments that I've seen in the media. And he does, again, it's a little bit like Pelosi's stance. Like, he supports the concept. He's wondering about, these issues of what they call jurisdiction, committee jurisdiction.
yeah,
And then what would the committee do? I think it's clear what the committee proposes to do if it gets in. It's like we're going to create, not we, I'm not on the committee.
Yeah.
They're going to create a 10-year plan for a Green New Deal. So we'll see how this hashes out.
what's it take to get a new committee like this established? Is it a vote of the full House?
I assume so. I'll be honest, I don't know exactly,
I
but
tried looking
I believe
to answer that question today.
I'm pretty
and I
certain
couldn't
it
figure
takes
out.
it would take the full House. I mean,
Yeah.
a select committee is different from a permanent committee or a standing committee, but I would assume that it would still take. First, you got to get the they're doing the grassroots approach by getting as many sign-ons as they can and building their way up, and then the idea, of course, is to get the caucus leadership to support it. So then you have to see if you can get a majority vote to get it passed, to get it through.
And that's why it's so important for...
And also, to be clear, it would be a bipartisan
Yeah.
committee. Any committee of Congress has to be bipartisan. It's just a matter of the numbers of who's, how many
If I'm
majority.
remembering right from Ocasio-Cortez's proposal, it's proposed to be 15 members, 9 Democrats and 6 Republicans.
Exactly, yeah.
So that Nancy Pelosi would appoint 9 of them, and
Yeah.
who's our new minority leader here? Kevin McCarthy.
Okay.
Coming in, he would appoint the other 6.
Yeah. So it's going to be a project. It's going to be a journey on that one.
It is, and in terms of the grassroots, which is what Peninsula Peace and Justice Center is all about, that's why we need to be on our own local representatives until they're signed on in this, and then stay with them through every step of the way, because this committee has to have more than just a name and has to be really empowered to write the legislation and all the other things. Let's talk for a while about some of the details that are anticipated in being in here. And although there is no legislation yet, in the outline for what this proposed select committee would be looking at are some really interesting things. Those of you here in the studio audience, you've got a little talking points. This is text taken directly from the outline, and I do encourage you to follow the link there and check out the rest of it. But what I really like about this is that in talking about the New Deal, it was not only a jobs creation program. There were elements of the New Deal back in the 30s that were also about economic justice.
Yeah.
So in addition to creating a lot of jobs through like the Public Works program, the minimum wage originated out of that same batch of legislation back then. And this proposal really pays a lot of attention to those elements, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah, it's really inspiring, I think, if you read through some of the legislation, some of the ideas that it's not legislation yet, but some of the concepts they're talking about, because they're talking about equity, social justice in job creation, and also specifically in addressing climate change. So they talk in parts of the proposal about what they call frontline communities. So typically, not entirely, but largely immigrant communities, communities of color, and poor working class white communities that are often on the front lines of the pollution zones and the climate impact zones, the harshest climate impact zones.
Environmental racism is the
And
term
classism,
that's-
yeah, racism and classism, yeah, and now it's taken on a much grander scope with climate change,
absolutely.
all around the world, and we see it domestically and globally, where frontline communities in other parts of the world are already getting just devastated by this stuff, and now we see it more in the U.S., whether it's massive, out of control wildfires, no matter how they started. Their size and scope is clearly connected to climate change. And then the absolutely voracious tornadoes and hurricanes that are, and storms that are just getting huger and huger in size and in their destructive abilities. And it's, on the one hand, climate doesn't care what race you are, what party you're in, or how much money you make. But the way we've set up not we, but the way society has set itself up, it's very, there is a deep race and economic component in who's affected most immediately by climate change. So this proposal talks about creating jobs in the communities that are being impacted most gravely by climate change, and creating those kinds of jobs that we've talked about.
Jobs and training.
Jobs and training, exactly. So oftentimes there's training that needs to happen. Another key thing that I just want to add to this that I think is important that I haven't seen talked about a whole lot is that a lot of the states where fossil fuel industry is strongest, such as West Virginia, Wyoming, Texas, Pennsylvania, and some other regions in the upper Midwest, which have huge fossil fuel production. These are also often where the highest emissions are. And so you have this need to both stop the fossil fuel production, whether it's everything from fracking in California and upstate New York and Pennsylvania to all kinds of mining, coal mining, for instance, in Wyoming and West Virginia and that in Kentucky. All of that needs to stop. But we also can't just tell folks you can't work in those jobs anymore. So what this is about addressing is saying, let's create jobs and training for folks who are in the fossil fuel industries as well, to allow them to move into something that's more sustainable while having hopefully a solid middle class existence or a viable existence.
We've certainly had this kind of, and still have ongoing kind of retraining programs as the economy changes and one skill set gets left behind and a new one is needed. I guess the difference here is that it's like everything else about this proposal on a much larger scale, and with the particular articulated concern of these most vulnerable communities. I do want to talk some more about the detail, and I hate to do this, but I need to break the fourth wall because I'm going to be turning shortly toward our audience, and I don't have an audience microphone set up. So if somebody, we do, it's taken care of. Thank you. Right. Okay, we're good. Back down with the fourth wall. Well, let me ask you, what else about some of these details really stands out to you? That one that you just mentioned is one of the things that really stood out to me.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing that I write about and think about a lot is the food industry and agriculture. I wrote a book called Diet for a Dead Planet, as mentioned, and I continue to write and think about this because the food industry is the single largest sector driving climate change, driving the emissions behind climate change. The single biggest, and yet it gets often barely mentioned when we talk about reform. And so this proposal starts to talk about it. I think we could talk about it a great deal more, in fact, in terms of, so I'll just go off on my own little proposal here, but I think this is part of what people are also thinking about, is how can we transition more farmers to organic farming, for instance, stop using pesticides, which both are based in fossil fuels, petroleum-based pesticides and for a lot of chemical fertilizers. And then, especially with the spraying, they also add emissions and pollution to the waterways and air. And then on top of that, they destroy soil and they deplete soil. And we need, studies continue to show that In the list of key important things, soil is right up there in the list of things that we really need to be focusing on. I'm not going to say it's the thing. I don't think there is just one thing that's the
No, I
magic
think
solution.
that's become clear.
Yeah, and it's a mistake for people to fixate on one thing as the solution. But it is clear that really repairing soil, agricultural soil around this country and around the globe is a fundamental part of the, so if you can provide funds and sometimes also jobs to help farmers transition and remediate that soil, replenish that soil, move to either no-till or lower-till agriculture, less tilling up of the ground, and again, no pesticides or fewer pesticides being used. So there's that. Then again, there's also mass transit, so expanding mass transit in metro areas and even non-metro areas around the country. I think that a big part of what happens is in rural areas, people are utterly dependent on their cars. Mm-hmm. And they drive long distances because they have to. And so you see people driving
to the store,
to store, to the job, to the clinic, wherever you have to go. Sometimes folks are driving 100 miles each way just to go to the hospital or the clinic or, whatever it is they need to do. So they're, using tons of fossil fuels in the process. So I think there's room to expand the mass transit system all around the country and to make it increasingly electric and therefore renewable and get away from all the diesel mass transit.
Yeah.
It has to be done in rail as well as buses, and it has to really, they have to start figuring out the airline situation too, flying, and how are we going to make that do hopefully far less of it, but also make what's done more sustainable or less destructive.
I know this is a little outside of your field of expertise. Do you have any idea how far off from electric planes we are?
I don't. Next article, maybe.
I'll look for that to be your next book or something. Yeah. Let's get the audience involved in here. Questions about the Green New Deal as it's been proposed. Christopher has read through it. I've read through it. What your own ideas are for what needs to be in a Green New Deal. And the way this works is just hold your hand up and wait for Steffi to arrive with the microphone. And then if you will stand up so our camera people can show your lovely faces to the audience at home. And hold the mic right up to your mouth.
Hello. So I was thinking I never heard of the Sunrise Movement until you were talking about it at the beginning. But I'm curious, do you know what the relationship between them and 350.org type people is?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. I mean, it's a friendly, as far as I know, it's a friendly relationship. I know they're in an alliance on this for sure. I've seen that on social media at the very least. And you'll see lists of different groups signed on to different measures, and they're very much in alignment on this. I mean, I'm sure they have ways in which they have different focal points, different agendas, but clearly they seem to be in alignment on this, along with Justice Democrats and a host of other environmental groups and climate action groups.
At their website, which is sunrisemovement.org, by the way, they have a page of endorsers, endorsing organizations. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure 350.org is
They're
on that
absolutely
list.
on there, yeah.
There's a long list, and you alluded to this, mentioned it briefly earlier, but a lot of labor support. They are making concerted effort to involve labor in this.
Absolutely, and with labor, it always comes down to, labor, like everything, is not a monolith. Mm-hmm. So you have different unions and different trades and different crafts, and some are far ahead of others in facing this, partially because it might be the leadership sometimes, but it's partially because of the very jobs they do. So naturally, some of the unions and workers who are involved in the fossil fuel industry are not automatically going to be at the forefront of this. But I think that what you are seeing in a lot of parts of the country is, the writing is on the wall with a lot of these industries. So with coal, for instance, I think that it's increasingly clear that These are not permanent jobs. People do travel from place to place and spend a couple years here, a couple years there, working on a pipeline or on a coal mine. But these jobs shut down, and the market for these products is starting to fade. And the signs are there that the markets are really expanding for renewable energy, and job creation is really expanding. That's one of the interesting things in doing this article, reading the reports, is that some of the sectors and areas where the fastest job creation is happening are actually in some of the renewable energy.
Renewables, yeah.
Yeah, and solar and wind and electric grid expansion and some other areas. So there's a lot of room for, I think, a pretty good range of jobs, from what they might call like more entry level to higher wage jobs.
Okay, another question in the back there.
Thank you. I'm delighted that this forum is happening. Thank you very much. My question is about mitigation that is not directly related to transportation or carbon dioxide reduction. I'm not very conversant with this. I'm going to do the best I can to try to communicate. But since you've both read the report, I'm wondering if there's any discussion, any proposals to help with the mitigation of radiative forcing, the radiative forces which are magnifying, for those of us that have been following this for a long time, climate change. Every time there is a reassessment, it seems to be happening faster. Part of that has to do with things that we didn't anticipate were going to be happening as the sea ice melts. It's black, and that absorbs. So, again, without going on at length, I think you're getting my drift. Is there anything in this proposal that addresses that? Because I think that seems to me, from scientists that I read, there's a lot of things that are possible. Just something as simple as painting rooftops white. So I'm wondering, and I'm hoping that this is being addressed within that proposal as well. Thank you for listening to my long-winded question.
Thank you for the question.
Great. No, that's a really excellent, interesting question. I don't have a complete answer. I mean, I think that, and they haven't spelled out that level of detail yet. But I think
my quick answer is they don't address particular technologies in this report. It's more a framework for how to proceed, so that they say things like decarbonizing the manufacturing, agricultural, and other industries, decarbonizing, repairing, and improving transportation. But they don't say how.
Right.
And that's part of the work of this committee, I think.
Exactly. So there's time, for all these types of details, technical and otherwise, to get into a proposal like that. So it's actually, I think, probably a key time for folks who are thinking about this kind of stuff and doing work on this to get in touch with their representatives. First and foremost, probably, well, I'm not going to tell you what you should do, but I think, the Green New Deal concept.
No, we do that all
also,
the time around here. Go ahead, tell them what to do.
I'm supposed to be a journalist, not telling you anything. but at the same time, so the larger concept, the Green New Deal, and real serious climate action, aggressive, vigorous climate action, but also the level of detail that needs to come in this. The one thing I was going to also mention is they do talk in conceptual level about adaptation, because we are at this stage with climate change where, maybe nobody knows exactly for sure, but we might already be at this stage of really looking at like adaptation and some mitigation, as opposed to full on just, we're not going to prevent it, we're not going to eliminate it, we're not, we're past that point.
We are indeed.
We are, and so the reality is that we're talking about a mix of mitigation and adaptation, and they do talk about that somewhat in this proposal.
That's
in
a good
terms
point.
of hardening, they call it hardening these communities, these frontline communities, in terms, so this could mean everything from financing walls in areas that are susceptible to sea level rise. It could also, involve, like, again, dealing with erosion is a big issue in many communities. So there's a lot of different, and you're welcome to look through on the website and elsewhere, So they talk about adaptation and really bolstering communities' ability to adapt to climate change, because this is going to be with us for quite some time. Everything from extended drought and really crazy seasonal shifts and extremes as well. So, another piece that comes to mind for me, again, with food production, is that you're going to need to provide more and more assistance to farmers, both to make the transitions I talked about before, but also to contend with the climate extremes that are already with us and that are expanding. And so you see farmers across the country just getting hammered by drought and seasonal shift. Seasonal shift is a key part because it's not as much of a huge headline as a hurricane or a drought. But when you have seasonal shift, then plants don't grow as much or as prolifically, or the crops are not as
Crops will have to change.
as big or as great. So there are a lot of impacts there that really need to be addressed.
Yeah. And in terms of adapting, different areas are going to have to adapt differently and at different times. Florida's, they should be figuring this out right now, how to adapt, because they are really threatened by the rise. They already experience flooding on a regular basis, and there's places in the Carolinas that constantly are flooding, even with a regular storm.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's no single formula for this. And I think that goes back to why a powerful, comprehensive committee like this that has a wide, detailed charge to it is so important to get that first step, because that turns the spotlight on the issue and keeps it there.
Yeah, and I think what it also does is it enables states and regions and localities to bring their story out and talk about how climate is affecting their community, how it's affecting everything from jobs and farms to community infrastructure, everything you can think of, really. And so it'll be fascinating if this committee just does get off the ground and they hold hearings. If you've got, it wouldn't be the first time Congress has held hearings on this, but you'd have hearings talking about the economic losses, the job losses in communities all around the country, which are in the hundreds of billions of dollars already. So yeah, that's the other piece when people talk about, well, why should we spend so much money on something like this? And, A, there are ways to do it that we could talk about, but B, we're already spending, upwards of $300 billion a year or more just handling these climate catastrophes, and that's bound to grow.
Invest some of that money up front. Okay, any more hands here? Okay.
The beauty of this proposal is that it comes at a time when the nation is thirsting for a new direction, with all the gnashing of teeth over politics as usual, and this, I presume, would be a Democratic push, because most of the climate deniers are in the other party. Who do you see in the Democratic Party as a leader? I know Ocasio-Cortez has been leading it so far, but she's rather young. Do you see any potential presidential candidates out there 2 years from now who might be good to lead this?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, absolutely. I think already you've seen some more veteran members of Congress support, and let's not underestimate, of course, the power of new energy in Congress, young or old. And so I think that already she's made an amazing stamp on the conversation just by doing what she's done. And there was that one protest that got a lot of attention, but a lot of it is also just real politicking. It's not sort of grandstanding. It's actually like using leverage and negotiating and whatever else you got to, what they have to do. So you've got John Lewis, Ro Khanna. There's some other more veteran members of Congress who are starting to get on board. And
in the Senate, Senator Ed Markey, I believe,
Ed Markey
is
just
a very
signed
avid
on.
supporter.
Yeah. He was, when he was in the House, he was on the Global Warming and Energy Independence Committee.
He was also a leader of the anti-nuclear weapons movement in Congress, which is why I remember
so
him.
There's some terrific, there's some folks there that have some good longevity to them and status that I think will be coming on board. And in terms of the presidential, I think that why I thought to even write about this, certainly the ideas, the policies, and where can the Democrats take some of these ideas, and how can they sort of respond to two things. There's the global reality of climate change and the economic realities of the need for better jobs, and then there's the political realities that people are seemingly far more ready for a lot of these forward-looking changes than politicians or the media give them credit for. Consistently, it seems to show that in the polling and in election returns often too, that people are, and just anecdotally, people are far more ready for this kind of stuff. So, Bernie Sanders is an obvious, just to mention him, is like one person who has already talked substantially. I remember when he was being in one of the debates in 2016, they were asked, what's the biggest national security threat? And he mentioned climate change. I mean, he highlighted climate change. And he is one of just a few politicians who's proposed a carbon tax, which is one of the key ways that we could talk about financing elements of a Green New Deal is through a carbon tax that taxes, I think it's something like 5 billion tons of carbon emissions in the US or something like that. And so putting a very, very tiny tax on that per carbon emission, but overall you get a lot of money to create those jobs around the country to do that kind of work.
I'm glad you mentioned financing it, because there's some really creative methods in here for financing. Proposal to establish public banks, for example, for regional purposes and infrastructure investment. Not too long ago, we did a program on public banks here, and that in itself is another small growing movement. I believe Los Angeles voters just endorsed the idea on the November ballot. And it's an idea that's moving forward, publicly owned banks for these things.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great idea to think about in terms of, I mean, there's so many reasons why public bank movement is taking off and is so important. And, what comes to mind is, every city or county, their accounts are basically held by a bank and managed by a private corporation and a bank, almost all of them, except for, say, North Dakota, which has its own public bank. Well, banks don't do this for free, do they? No. There you have it. So it's like, on one level you've got the profit margin that goes to the bank, which could be returned to public coffers, a good portion of that. And then you've got far more public direction in how that money is invested and where that money is directed and how it's loaned out as well. So that's a huge difference that, people have talked about public power as well, which is something that they haven't talked about a lot yet in this proposal, but, there's still time, so maybe they will. But, we have movements in California for public power, and certainly with PG&E's ongoing disasters, there's more and more of a push in different communities for community choice aggregation on the state and local level, and these are initiatives where, again, you take away the profit margin aspect of the situation and you give the public and their representatives say in both what type of energy infrastructure we're actually using, how much and how quickly can be transitioned to something far more, sustainable and renewable, and why wouldn't and again, where's the money being invested? So,
and where does the return on that investment end up? That's another forward-looking thing that I like about this proposal, because it discusses that things like the federal government invests in a lot of things through various methods, and yet people end up with patents that end up privatizing the profits that come out of this research. This proposal is saying, no, the people of the United States are going to keep a piece of that action, so that if patented technology comes out of this, some portion of that will go back to the U.S. Treasury. I think the report, maybe I read this separately, mentions in particular Tesla. The Tesla cars, they were originally developed with a lot of federal money investment, but if Elon Musk ever actually starts turning a profit, that's going to stay with Mr. Musk. It's not. None of that investment is going to return.
Take it to Mars or wherever.
Yeah, he'll take it to Mars.
Yeah.
and set up a public bank with it or something.
Yeah.
We're starting to get a little short on time. What else is happening out here in the audience? Any other? Yeah, right behind you there. Oh, okay. You can go next.
I had a question about the food situation. One of the things that I haven't heard too much about is the economic implications if the food production distribution crisis gets worse and worse. What are the financial ramifications for that?
Yeah, interesting question. I don't have real super specific data for you on that, but it's certainly been looked at a fair amount. I know that years ago when there was more of a conversation about what they called peak oil. There was there was more talk about the oncoming scarcity and the need for more local and regional self-reliance and in food production being perhaps the most primary thing. To get away from this idea of having every item of food on average traveling about 1,300 to 1,500 miles, which is totally unsustainable on so many levels. I don't know exactly in terms of the cost, but I think that this is another key aspect, is getting back to more local and regional foods. I don't think it means that communities need to become, insular, that you can't have regional trade, international trade. I think you don't want to go to the point of total, isolation and insularity. I don't think that's neither necessary nor helpful. But I think that what is needed is a certain level of ability for communities to feed themselves and regions to feed themselves and sustain themselves. And I talk about this a lot more in my book and some other articles about the need for a much larger shift in the food system. It's much bigger than just moving away from pesticides to organic. It's also about more local and regional production, more diversified production, getting away from, we right now have heavily subsidized commodity production, and most of that goes into feeding livestock for meat and for fuel production, so biofuel. So, it's an interesting debate because there's still a transition in which, we, still seem to, quote, need biofuels as part of the equation because they're seen as better than the alternative. And there's there's debate about that because the way that it's often produced, you sometimes have biofuels being processed in a coal-fired plant and then, and then not always, but sometimes, and then shipped with semi-trucks using fossils. It's not there yet, But I think that the point being that there really needs to be a shift away from producing for these large industries that have almost nothing to do with food and nothing to do with sustainability at all. The livestock industry being one of the biggest pieces of the food industry's harm on the environment and climate. So we have to get back to diversified, not just local, but regional production and less long-distance transportation of food. And so that's a part of so the Farm Bill is now up in the Senate and the House, and I can't remember which version has passed. They keep, debating it and hashing it out, but this is a massive investment. This is the largest piece of legislation that happens other than the overall budget. And, they're talking in general terms about the same old, with a few modifications. But, so this is an area where policy needs to really transform greatly. And so it'll be interesting coming up in the new Congress to see, I'd say sort of a three-layered interaction between the Green New Deal, and then we have the People's Budget, which is annually proposed by the Progressive Caucus, which I have an article coming out about soon, and then also the Farm Bill. And can that be made something that's much more sustainable environmentally and in terms of climate harm and cost as well? So.
All very good points. Did you have a question here after lugging this microphone around all
Lugging
afternoon?
it so much. Well, actually, my question was also related to agriculture and how we need to transform agriculture to make it more sustainable and to make the communities in which food is being produced now more sustainable as well, because many of those are dying. So you've reported on this long before the Green New Deal became such a hot topic. Do you see in this proposal enough addressing of the transformation of agricultural systems? And if not, what do you think we need to build into this to make it more adequate?
Yeah, also a great question. I mean, I don't yet, but I don't want to say that they're not thinking about it or that, we haven't seen the full extent of their proposal. And there's not just one. I think that what we all have to keep in mind is that the proposal right now is for the select committee, and everybody, including certainly foremost Ocasio-Cortez, knows that this isn't just about passing her 10-year Green New Deal. That ain't going to happen no matter who proposes it. So, we'll see what evolves in the legislation. I don't currently think that it's being talked about enough, but that's, again, something that is a work in progress, I think, on all layers of discussion around climate action.
Yeah,
and I think it's to their credit that they are at least talking about, you see the word soil and you see agriculture being talked about in the Green New Deal. So that's an advance on where we've been in the past.
Yeah, that was going to be my point, that everywhere it lists industry, it also talks about agriculture, decarbonizing industry and agriculture. And
it's a good start, and I think that, the other thing for us all to remember is that, not everything's going to happen with one piece of legislation, unfortunately.
Right,
So
and this probably won't be one piece of legislation.
probably not in the end, yeah.
It probably will be something that will go to energy and commerce or over to Raul Galvin, natural resources.
Absolutely.
So we've got 1 minute left. What do you hope, what do you expect to see in January? Is there going to be movement on this?
I think there will absolutely be a lot of conversation and pushing on this, and there'll be some movement, and I don't want to be either too hopeful or too dour about it. I mean, I think that
it is Washington.
It is Washington after all, but let's not treat anything as a purely static entity. So let's hope that, with the level of urgency that climate change presents, climate crisis presents, I think there's a chance. I think there's a legitimate chance for something on this to happen in the new Congress.
Okay, let's leave it there on a good chance. I've been talking with Christopher D. Cook, author and investigative journalist. Thanks so much for joining us here, and good luck to us all on a Green New Deal.
Exactly. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you all for being here.